So what we're going to do is I'm going to offer the first question to our panelists, and then we will open it up again to Q&A from both the audience and our folks in person and our folks at home. One of the things I really love about your presentations is the ways that they overlap so much thematically, but there is still so much difference in terms of time and space, right? There's so many things that change in over several hundred years. And so I would love to hear Dr. DeGooyer and Dr. Steiner, what did you take away from the other panelists' talk? What did you learn? How does it influence your own thinking about your subject matter of expertise? Whoever wants to start.
I can start since Dr. Steiner's sitting down still. You ended your talk by talking about naturalization, and my book that just came out is on naturalization, the history. And what your talk reminds me is that naturalization is these tests that you took. I'm a Canadian about to naturalize. They're really new. They didn't exist in America till the 50s, and in the UK, they were introduced in 2004. So the idea that immigration controls belonging.
You're so close together.
This is a great symbolic architecture. The idea that immigration is in charge of belonging.
It's silent though. There's nothing. Just take the laptop away.
You think
Francis's trial here. We're just going to try different scientists. We're trying different things.
Is it still doing that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the idea that belonging is something that immigration is in charge of. Just from the perspective of my research, just mind-blowingly new. The fact that language, how you feel about someone else's traditions is like regulated by the state, as you showed. It just reminds me again that it's just not a large feature of most of the history of migration. And I don't know what to do with that in terms of the future, but from what I'm talking about, that's just not a component at all.
The fact that refugees have always been very well received when they are seen as bringing some kind of benefit. The Huguenots are a great example of that. They were wealthy. They were the wealthy middle class of France. And France, from what I understand, really suffered significantly economically after they left because of so much of this expertise and wealth left with them. Thank you for the Go, Went, Gone novel. That's definitely something I would add to my reading list. If I can put one on your reading list as well, I would put it on yours, but you've already read it. Exit West. Exit West is a phenomenal book. It's contemporary. It's wonderfully unclear exactly where they're from deliberately. So I don't want to say too much because there's just a lot going on there, but it's a great, great book. Great novel.
Over here first. I will come and bring the mic.
Yeah, about the citizenship. You did not mention how somebody can become a citizen of Israel. What were the considerations? Religion, Jewish, or born as a Jew? How to prove it? And then you take the case of India. In 1947, it was 3 countries. It has become India, Pakistan, and today Bangladesh. How do you decide who belongs where? In 1947, the Viceroy Mountbatten asked a surveyor from London to come to Delhi. He gave him 2 weeks to draw lines on the map of India and make it 3 countries. Now today, Chinese are spread all over East Asia, they are seen by the face of it. And they are decided they are Chinese. And they are sent back to China, some of the countries. And Myanmar, it is a country of Buddhists. There are Hindus and Muslims. They say, we don't want you here. You get away, wherever you want to go, you go. So this is citizenship. And in my view, there it is important that every human being has at least 3 citizenships. And he can choose any time, depending on the evolution of the political situation of the world. And these 3 are world citizen passport.
Any response to that idea? Or has anything like that ever been tried?
The Nansen passport. The Nansen passport was developed in Norway, and it was given to denationalized Jews who Germany no longer wanted to recognize, making them effectively stateless. And so the Nansen passport was a passport that was given to them that other nations could recognize in the absence of a German passport. So it's pretty historically important, but of course it requires goodwill. The other nations have to be willing to recognize it.
I would just say a word about statelessness. That is a grim fate to face. The Rohingyas are a much overseen refugee population, kicked out of Myanmar, forced into Bangladesh. They don't want them either. That's a great tragedy that people should know about. What's interesting about stripping people of citizenship is that European countries really don't do that if it's going to render someone stateless. It's hard to lose citizenship. But if it happens, it's because something like you were a member of ISIS, and so we're going to strip you of citizenship because you still have this other citizenship. Now, there's this case that I just heard about the other day where Britain has stripped a woman of British citizenship with the understanding, well, she's Bangladeshi, but
she's of descent.
and Bangladesh saying, no, we don't want her either. And so that's one of these rare cases where this woman might really be rendered stateless by the act of the British government, but the British still insist, no, she has or should at least be able to claim Bangladeshi citizenship. So it's a terrible thing.
That's one of those dangerous new precedents that I was talking about when citizenship becomes a privilege rather than a right, because it opens up the door for denationalization. And Britain's done it about 545 times, not necessarily rendering everybody stateless, but it's more common than you'd think. It's still not something that all citizens have to worry about, but it happens. And in this case, they're saying that she's of a descent and can be returned. So yeah. And that's what Arendt was talking about in 1914. Statelessness becomes a new phenomena because when you're expelled from a nation and nobody receives you, you're stateless. And that for her was what was the major difference from historical times, is that suddenly nobody would claim you and you had nowhere to go with any kind of, with anybody. And we can remember that boat that came to America full of Jewish refugees and was famously turned away, right? It would happen, no country was receiving Jewish refugees, or very few. And if they were receiving them, they were detaining them, as in France. So statelessness is what she saw as the modern world's new identity for refugees.
We'll take the question in the back, and then pink, and then blue. Right? 1, 2, and 3. We gotta have fast hands here, friends. That's how this works.
My big question is, how do you prove persecution? Because it sounded to me like what the French were doing to the Muslims was textbook persecution, which should entitle them to refugee status anywhere in the world.
So you do not actually have to prove persecution. you have to prove a well-founded fear of persecution. The idea, I think, is that you can't really prove persecution, right? If you showed up with torture marks, a cynic could say, well, those are self-inflicted. So you don't, in fact, have to prove persecution. It's a well-founded fear of persecution that you have to demonstrate. And these are interview processes. If you want, there's a great documentary. It's called Well-Founded Fear.
So good.
This is really worth watching. It's about 20 years old now, but it's still very relevant. And it hats off to it was called the INS at the time. They let a camera crew follow 6 or 7 asylum officers around their offices for a number of weeks. And it's a remarkably human experience. I mean, you're the asylum seeker, I'm your case officer, and I've got your files, and I'm interviewing you, and ultimately, I either believe you or I don't. It's kind of that simple. It's stark that it goes out. But again, I appreciate that the film was willing to show the process that way.
One of the things about that document I also teach, because it's so powerful, is that you see what happens when an asylum seeker has a terrible translator. It shows the bad translation. And so you're trying to prove persecution, but whoever's translating you, it's just not getting the right words out. And you can be refused so sadly on a bad translation. And oftentimes it's arbitrary. There's been all kinds of studies about, I'm mixing this up, but how certain courts in Florida are more receptive to this kind of immigrant, and it's not the same. It can be. It's very frustrating, I think.
And you have to watch this Well-Founded Fear to the end, because in the end, it also follows about 10 asylum seekers. And at the end, it reveals who got asylum and who didn't. And some of the cases you'll agree with, and others you'll go, wow, that's not the decision I would have reached.
Awesome. I'm acknowledging the question in the Q&A. You will be next after
I'm sorry?
our 2 in-person questions.
I have it on reserve from the library.
I understand from both your talks better about this issue. I mean, I hadn't thought about a lot of the things that you've explained about immigration, assimilation, etc. Okay, do either of you have any, solutions? What do we do now?
I have a well-founded fear of what the solution will be. Part of what I just came home from Europe, I was in Sweden at a small refugee reception center in the countryside, trying to get a look at how a country like Sweden, as Niklaus mentioned, is now firmly in control by a populist government, how they went from being so wide open in 2015 to very, very concerned about refugees and wanting to close the doors. I think what we're going to see, and this isn't my solution, is that the United States is going to follow what the UK is doing or trying to do, and what Australia has done to great effect, which is what we call offshoring refugees. So I'll give Australia as a great example. A lot of refugees, asylum seekers, thank you for that helpful definition, would arrive on this place called, is it Easter Island or Christmas Island in Australia? Okay, it's one of the holidays. Right. And this is Australian territory. And they would go there and try and claim asylum. But what Australia did is they did this nifty little legal loophole where they declared that that island was no longer Australia if you were an asylum seeker. So, yeah, this happens. And then they would fly all these people to Papua New Guinea, where, like Turkey, they gave some kickbacks to this poor state. Said you house them. These are prisons. I mean, there's a beautiful, beautiful book. I don't know if you've read it, called No Friend But the Mountains, and it's about a Kurdish asylum seeker who ends up detained there. And while he's there, he taps out on his cell phone. The most beautiful memoir I've ever read. But it's also about the inhumanity of this. Donald Trump thought this was excellent, and it sounds. But now the UK is trying to do this with Rwanda. Right? So, and we, as we were talking about, the US is thinking about doing this with Mexico, and it's offshoring. It's saying, look, we don't have the political goodwill to bring in the millions of people. So let's find a poor state we can kind of shunt them over to. My fear, which I think is well founded, is that we're going to see this as the solution going forward. As people are going to move, that's not going to stop. But what I think is going to, there's a lot of pushback and legal challenge to the Rwanda scheme right now. But I think, fearfully, that this will be the solution. I don't know if you have it.
Yeah, my solution is simple. Buy my book. Just kidding. Just kidding. This book is actually full of questions. It has absolutely no answers. It's just full of questions. But I do think, I think in the European case, one solution would be to open immigration channels. Because there is abuse of the asylum process. So really, let's just let more people in through this immigration channel, which could then sort of give more credibility to the asylum process. I think that would be a really smart thing to do. And then, just like the United States, right? The United States lets in all kinds of immigrants for all kinds of reasons, including the diversity lottery. I don't know if you about the diversity lottery is amazing, right? 50,000 people are randomly chosen every year by the United States to come in. That's inconceivable for Switzerland, but maybe it's not a bad idea. But instead of 55,000, make it many more, because let's also keep in mind declining birth rates and aging demographics. These countries, they're going to need workers to sustain their welfare state. The United States will face that problem as well at some point, but Europe especially needs it. So I would say open more immigration channels to sort of free up the refugee and build more credibility in the refugee process. That'd be one suggestion. I am fearful about the future of the asylum process in Europe. I think I think this idea of protecting refugees will always remain. Le Pen and all them will say, of course we protect refugees. But they will just whittle and whittle and whittle and whittle it down so it becomes more or less meaningful. I don't think any of these countries will actually unsign the 51 Convention or just abandon that process. But I think they'll just render it almost meaningless. This safe third country rule is an interesting one, right? I mean, all these countries have this idea that if you've come to us through a safe third country, we can send you back to that country because you should apply for asylum there. I mean, that makes sense. That's not an unreasonable thing to say in the European context. Except if you're Italy and Greece, right? Because Italy and Greece, just by sheer dumb luck, you're the ones getting all these asylum seekers. So it's really unfair to say, well, you need to go back to Italy and you need to go back to Greece. So I think that's what we're going to see more and more, this offshoring safe third country rules, which in theory isn't necessarily repulsive, but I think in practice will become more and more morally troubling. So I worry about our commitment to refugees.
Okay, getting back to the United States. What if Texas became really serious about seceding from this now loose confederation of states? Because we even have a House member who has recommended that we have blue versus red, or Florida wants to secede. I mean, back in the 70s, people used to joke about, well, the last American out of Florida, please take the flag. So here we are.
Oregon, too, has recently been talking about it. Oregon.
No chance. There's no way the United States government would allow a state to secede. It's just...
We had a problem with that back in the 1800s.
Right. And it didn't work. Like most secessionist movements, they failed, right? There's just no way a federal government... Look at Russia. Look at what Putin did in Chechnya. This is a tiny spot in Russia, and yet he fought tooth and nail to hang on to that. It's very interesting that the existing nation state simply does not see territory or people, especially if it's something as massive as Texas with military bases and whatnot. It's just... Now, what's interesting more is Eastern Oregon wants to join Idaho. Now, suppose that's, I'm not a scholar there, but I suppose that's probably, if those states agree to that, that might work. But seceding from the Union, that's just wishful thinking on the part. Great propaganda for politicians in Texas, but I just cannot imagine that happening.
I have a brief follow-up.
Great.
I know a lot of people in my generation have said, oh, where can we go if a certain person is reelected as president? And if it turns out we were thinking Canada, no, we're too old. They won't take us. Where can we go?
Okay, I love this because I am Canadian. I will. And when the question is where, if a certain president you don't like is elected, or to go back to the Locke, the right to leave, right? If I don't like my contract with the sovereign, where can I go? When the former president was elected, many of my friends went on their social media and said, I'm moving to Canada. And as a historian of immigration, I was like, you can't, this is like a hubris that Americans have, that they can leave when they want. And you have to remind people that, you know, even I, going back to Canada, would be full of legal, you know, it's laws and challenges and, you know, where have you paid your taxes? But I think it's a good, I'm glad that you brought this up because I think it makes people, many Americans have experienced what people around the world experience in much more horrific ways when a dictator takes over or something happens, right? That feeling of where can I go to escape? It gives us some sympathy, maybe, right? But you have to get in the lines, right? And join the lotteries.
I think it's interesting, right? The right to leave.
Canary Islands.
The right to leave does not match a right to enter, right? There's a profound difference. Yes, we have the right to leave. We do not have the right to enter.
But you can, if you have a spare $100,000, buy a passport for a small country.
Many countries. And
Bahamas,
I love discussing
Turks and
this.
Caicos.
I love discussing this with my students because some students think this is just brilliant. Of course you should sell citizenship.
Malta.
And others just think this is appalling. It's an interesting idea, buying a citizenship of a country.
Peter Thiel did it with New Zealand. Yeah.
All right, friends, my computer is about to die. So I'm going to read this, and then Graham, I'm going to need your help flagging me down if anybody has any other questions. So we have, thank you, anonymous attendee. The American and French revolutions created the idea of citizenship as a way to define human rights. But now the concept of citizenship is a key threat to human rights for millions of people, ? Is this the anti-rights consequence of the, quote, age of democratic revolutions and the concept of equal citizenship?
Well,
Yeah, read.
I'm going to read it again.
Unless you got it.
The American and French revolutions created the idea of citizenship as a way to define human rights. But now the concept of citizenship is a key threat to human rights for millions of people. So the tension between human rights and citizenship. Is this the anti-rights consequence of the, quote, age of democratic revolutions and the concept of equal citizenship?
I can take the first part if you want to take the second. I'll give you Arendt's answer, Hannah Arendt's. We think of citizenship and human rights as together, but because when the French Revolution happened, it was on behalf of we the people, in the name of human rights. But the problem, as Arendt points out, is that it was never intended for all people. That's just what the Haitians tried to prove. It was intended for French people, right? And as she pointed out, you can't have human rights unless you have citizenship, because who will guarantee your human rights when you've been expelled from the country of your citizenship, right? This is the major international problem. And so citizenship, in some ways, is the same as human rights, because without citizenship, how do you enforce your right to belong? Citizenship for her was the right. Without it, you really have nothing. You become stateless, which is true. So I see that part as being right. I don't know about the populist part. Maybe you have thoughts.
No, but I would just agree. That's exactly the citizenship is only something that's measurable in regard to a relationship with the state. And once you render stateless, that's why it's such a dismal state to have. That's why the Rohingyas in Bangladesh, for example, stuck with no human rights and no citizenship.
We're really solving things up here.
Brent, did you have a question?
Oh, it sounded to me like the right to leave is Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never actually leave. And I was curious about this gentleman that lived for like 20 years in a French airport because he was stateless.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah, didn't Robert Snowden try and live in the airport as well?
And I think he just died, the gentleman stuck in that Paris airport. Yeah, I do not understand. That's a very strange case because when he died, I read the obituary. He did periodically leave the airport. I don't understand that case. Yeah. Read the obituary. Like he.
I don't know. Well,
it's you're absolutely right. It's an incredibly strange case.
There are stateless people in the United States. I'm not exactly sure on the numbers. It could be in the thousands, could be more. Most of them are from former Yugoslavian countries. They came over here during the war. Then the countries that they were from dissolved, and suddenly they don't have American citizenship, so they're here under whatever status. So they're effectively stateless. So you see, that's actually, statelessness is more common than not. You think of the Thai cave rescue, right? 2 of the boys in that cave were stateless and then magically were given citizenship because they were famous, effectively, the Thai government. So statelessness is, people live stateless in states all the time. So that's one of the funny things about being stateless. You don't have to be in an airport or in the airplane. You can be stateless in a state. It's just that nobody will recognize you as a member. Yeah. Really weird status.
The UN Charter begins, "We the peoples of the United Nations." My question is, did anybody argue then or more recently about what peoples really means and why that's a better word than "we the nation states of the United Nations"?
My guess is it has to do with an aspiration of universality, that there are universal human rights that we all have simply because we are human beings, independent of country, of time, context. So my guess is that's what they're aspiring to, is the peoples of the earth as humans have these rights that the UN Charter is going to defend.
I think it's the same because the other 2 declarations were made by states who were coming into existence, right? The French Republic and the American, and America. So it was really, those declarations, while they were made on behalf of natural law and ostensibly all people, were really concerned with those states. So the UN had to really distinguish that it was referring to people in all contexts. But in practice, it's very hard to understand how that works. Because even we've been talking about the 1951 convention, refugee convention, and my students are always tripped up because they're like, well, they all sign it, but they all can just not abide by it. And I was like, that's correct. You don't, there's a kind of opt-out rule. You don't have to always. And so that they're very confused by that, like what is binding and what is not. Technically being shamed by the United Nations is something that would bind you to them, but not always. In the case of the UK right now, they don't seem to be very shamed.
Yeah, that UNHCR, I think, is in a precarious position right now. 95% of its funding or so comes from the US, Japan, and the EU, European countries. And so it's hard for them to take a harsh stand against its major donors. There are people, I talked about people wanting to expand the definition of a refugee. And I think a lot of people say, you know what, it's hard enough to cling on to the definition that we currently have. Any kind of expansion of it will just even denigrate our credibility even more. People will just not even acknowledge that anymore.
And there's political risks to having a new convention, because then you open up the possibility that you'll even have more restrictive laws. Like it's having the convention we have is already a tremendous gift to international law, and the risks of trying to rewrite it mean you could have a worse version, potentially.
It is good that we are discussing this subject on how to stay.
Right.
All right. I saw a question over. I'm going to go 1 and then 2, please.
I despair of us in this country resolving much about immigration, and yet resolving much is the polarization we have that's paralyzed their political process. And yet, we didn't want the Irish, they were the bad immigrants. We didn't want the Italians, they were the bad immigrants. We didn't want the Puerto Ricans, we didn't want the Jews. The ship, by the way, was the St. Louis, and there's a movie, Ship of Fools, that you should watch. It's old, but it speaks to the subject. We started with guest workers in this country, and I grew up in El Paso with braceros. During the Second World War, we needed field workers because the men had been called away for military service. And they, by and large, did go home. They sent their money home, but not all of them. In El Paso, the pictures you get, by the way, there is no wall in El Paso. If you've ever lived there, there's a shallow ditch, and you can't get anything wetter than the back of your feet, okay? There just isn't a barrier there. And if you ever go to El Paso, the immigration stations are 40 miles out of town. If you're leaving, you have to pull off the highway and go through and declare that you're a U.S. citizen or such. So because we passed through these things successfully in the past, I have some hope that the Irish, the Italians, the Puerto Ricans, the Jews, etc., all we managed to integrate and managed to get past saying they're not us, etc., etc., that we may come to that place again. I don't see it soon, and I'm not sure. I say I'm mature. I'm not old. We don't use the old word, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be around to see it, but I still have.
I feel like you do as well. And we talked about this the first time we met, Niklaus and I, when we had a lunch. I think that the Republican Party, where you tend to see a lot more anti-immigrant sentiment, although not exclusively, has done an effective job at convincing Americans about why immigration's bad. And that, by the way, historically, xenophobia it's really easy. You see it. I talked about a lot of the differences between old refugees and new ones. One of the continuities is xenophobia has always been useful. It's a distraction. It's perfect. You don't want someone to see this? Look over there, that. It's perfect. What I wish we had more of is better narratives from the Democrats about why, instead of ignoring, which is what you tend to get. We need more narratives about why immigrants refugees, asylum seekers are beneficial, because leaving it to goodwill isn't useful. I mean, and this is why Florida and Texas are doing this political stunt of busing migrants to New York and Martha's Vineyard, because they want to say, what are you going to do? And I think we're going to need those narratives if we're going to slice through what is gross polarity right now.
I would take it a step further and I'd say the Democrats have to be willing to articulate some kind of policy on restrictions. Democrats are very good at criticizing the other side, but have not been good at articulating what exactly they're for. And because they've been unable to articulate what they're for, it's easy to accuse them of being for open borders.
And what is open
borders? And then they're like, well, no, we're not for open borders. And then it's, okay, so where do you want to put restrictions? It's like, I'd rather not talk about that. I think the Democrats really have got to start being willing to have a conversation about restrictions. And if they don't, they're going to keep getting bashed by Republicans. I think a huge block to immigration reform is what to do with the 11 million odd undocumented people. I think both sides are just a logjam. Like, Republicans tend to say, well, we're not going to deal with them until we've secured the border. Democrats tend to say, well, we're not going to we're going to not talk about the border until we've dealt with them. And there just is absolutely no willingness to compromise on this. And they've got to come together, because there is no solution that I can see to the 11 million undocumented people except to grant them legal status, because you can't deport them all. There's absolutely no way you're deporting 11 million people, and leaving them the way they are is just, that's really exploitative of them and so many other people.
Never say never.
Polarization, idiocy we hear now scares me.
It's politically useful. Xenophobic, nativist rhetoric, even if you don't mean it, it works really well to galvanize a base quickly, politically. You don't have to mean any of it. And that's unfortunate, because while we're having these, incredibly Fox News-esque style discussions, real people need solutions. And that's the shame of all of it, is that it's so politically useful that almost nothing gets done about a real problem. And I don't know. I think there's really good solutions that absolutely, the idea here is that we can't just say all borders should be open. That's foolish in the sense that it means nothing. We have to have a conversation about how and why it's like when you prepare for something that's bad that's about to happen, you get your food in order, you get your supplies. We need to be planning infrastructure for all of this, but instead we're having, polemical debates about things. By we, I don't mean, I mean this imaginary we.
Democrats used to be very willing to talk about immigration restrictions for the sake of protecting labor. Labor unions tended to be for immigration restriction. It was Republicans who tended to be for more open borders. It's interesting how that has switched. And I hear this in my class all the time. And I think partly because the rhetoric on the other side has become somewhat xenophobic, somewhat racist, that I think my students just, sort of left of center students, they don't want to talk about restrictions because restrictions are racist. Like, well, no, that's not one and the same thing. You've got to be willing to talk about where to put immigration restrictions if we're going to move forward on this, or else you're just going to get accused of open borders. So I think that's the big challenge of the Democrats. Bernie Sanders in 2016, you might remember, someone asked him about, so what do you think about open borders? He goes, oh, that's a nightmare. That's a Koch brothers idea, or more immigration. And, that's sort of the traditional Democratic position to take. And he got lambasted for that. And 6 months later, he came back and said, oh, I've been educated on immigration. Well, I'm not sure he was really educated. I think the Democrats have just really shifted a lot over the last 20, 30 years on this.
Bush who tried to, Junior, that tried to pursue amnesty.
And Ronald Reagan and the Democrats in Congress passed amnesty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. In 2007, it was Bush, it was McCain, and Ted Kennedy, and a lot of people were lined up to do it. but it just failed. And unfortunately, I don't think that's not happening anytime soon.
As there are more failed states, Libya, Haiti, Mali, Congo on the precipice, those people aren't persecuted by their government because there's no government. Mm-hmm. They just out of luck, huh?
Yeah, the nation state system looks good on paper. When you look at the atlas and you've got 195 places, clearly defined, government's in charge. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. You're absolutely right. We haven't even talked about internally displaced people, IDPs. IDPs are essentially refugees who have not been able to cross their border. They are stuck within their own country. Internally displaced people. People have been forced to flee, and they are in an incredibly precarious position because international law doesn't cover them because they are still within their country. They're not crossing the international border. And a lot of times their governments don't let in any kind of aid to help them. You see this in a lot of places. So IDPs are, along with stateless people. And there are more IDPs than there are refugees worldwide.
Right. And one of the things that always my students are always sort of amazed by is that by the time you get labeled a refugee, you get asylum, you're probably one of the richer people from where you're coming because you've had the money and the means to get out. Already that's a privileged position than those that can't leave.
Back to the solution, if I may. I mean, we got to address the root causes. That's difficult. That is unbelievably difficult and a long-term big investment. And Europe is noodling around with this. They have various development funds trying to develop various countries in Africa. But what those funds are really being used for is stopping people from leaving. It's not really doing what it's supposed to do. Kamala Harris went down to Central America, right? That's all that. I mean, it's a good idea, but boy, how are you going to rebuild El Salvador, Congo, Libya, these places? That is tough to do. I don't know if we have the political will or the resources to do it. My guess is building barriers is going to be what we end up doing. But addressing the root causes, which is everything, let's be honest, addressing farm subsidies. Why are we growing corn in the United States and then dumping cheap corn into Mexico to put Mexican corn farmers out of business? Arms dealings, all kinds of ways that we're interconnected with the world that we don't realize. I think we don't fully recognize so many of our actions ultimately lead to people having to move out of their country, whether it's for persecution or something else. Climate change being a great example. And we haven't even talked about that yet, but that's an absolutely overwhelming thought of how many millions of people are going to be forced to flee their homes in the decades ahead. And where are they going to go? I don't want to leave us on that grim topic, but that is something we are not paying any attention to at all.
You won't leave us on that because we've got about two more questions.
Great.
No, Brent has one, and then who would like the final question? Awesome. Okay, we'll return to you.
I've actually got two, but one will be easy, the other one may not be. First one's for Niklaus. I've been sitting here for, all morning, but since you've been speaking maybe an hour and a half, what's the significance on that book jacket cover of the 68 and the 60?
You know, I'm so glad you asked. I don't know, but I wanted a book cover that was a little abstract. I didn't want something that screamed migration. So I came across this image. I think those are life jackets. I think those are upside down lifeboats. I took that to be a good image of what was going on in Europe in 2015, 2016. My guess is that's just, probably in Greece as they were accumulating life jackets and as they were pulling people out of the sea. I did not take the picture. It's a stock photo.
Second question for both of you. I don't know if I've got my facts right, but it seems like the United States lets in every procedure that they do, like 100,000 high technical people, computer, medical, and there seems to be a cap on that, but the vast majority of the interest groups and the people want substantially more than that. what's the deal with the Democrats and Republicans not being able to agree on more coming in?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great question. Why they can't agree on this? I think, interestingly, there's concern about, and I don't like the term low-skilled workers because I think, to me, necessary and unnecessary workers is a more reasonable way to go about it, because a lot of these unskilled workers they're necessary. We need them. Let's just be honest, because none of us are going down east to pick the tobacco. So I think with those kind of low-skilled workers, the fear is always about competition with wages and driving wages down. And I think that's probably similar with those kind of those high-skilled workers as well, that engineers from India will suppress the wages of American workers. I think it's a similar kind of dynamic as well. But it's just so, it seems like both parties can't even have normal conversations about these kind of issues anymore. It seems like one side is so focused on the border and securing the border, and the other on criticizing that approach without coming up with other solutions.
But it is interesting because business has has always had a long-standing interest in bringing in immigrant labor, skilled and unskilled, and you'd think that they would have more power of lobbying over either of the parties to make, you know what I'm saying? Like, they have a very deep interest in ways that American workers don't, but businesses do. So I agree with you. The question it's a good one. I'm surprised that they don't have a more powerful hold. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Bill Gates.
Skilled workers from India
Mm-hmm.
and visas and all, and American workers being laid off and training the other people coming in. Is there not a benefit to business, to some of the grayness and the other issues where a certain industry basically gets what it wants, where if you have a law that applies to everybody, every industry gets what they want. There's certain businesses that have gotten what they want, and they're happy with what they do now. And I guess I'd insert a question about the whole issue of the business groups' impact on this whole issue. It's not the people at the border that they're interested in, it's their own business and how they are affected and how they can lobby and get what they want. Way. Can you comment on why citizenship and residency? If you invest a certain amount of money, you can bring your family in. Doesn't the U.S. have I know in Europe they can do that.
The U.S. has an investor lottery, an investor visa that I think 1.9 million, I think, is at this point. Although I think if you invest in more economically distressed areas, the number drops to about 1.2 million. It's interesting. Different places have been raised. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't really have an opinion, but I do have a sense that not everybody wants to solve the issue at the border. There are politicians who use it for their own ends to get elected, and there are businesses that are focused on their business. And if they can get investors in, then solving the HB1 situation or having guest workers or anything else, they're not looking for an overall solution. And so for them, it's not really a problem other than maybe in terms of reputation.
I mean, I have an example that's it's not exactly about business, but I know a lot of immigration lawyers, and they talk about this kind of person who is maybe a Republican, maybe agrees with anti-immigration, but then has an undocumented person working for them. And they go to the law firm and say, "Can you just get my guy?" And the lawyer has to say, "It doesn't work like that, it's not like that." So there, you kind of see that that kind of like, I need this for my business. This is my little community. But, you know, to do that, you have to change the whole climate of immigration. So I think there is, you know, that's part of the issue, is that you can't really just have your business and not the rest of the country responding in the same way. But lots of lawyers have told me they've had multiple, you know, that's common.
I gave the last question up, so you may have a very succinct response, but we will at least get to ask.
Yes. This is very important where we are ending the discussion. We find the whole world rather rudderless. And we have a population on this small planet, 8 billion people. The great country who can give leadership is United States. It is going through a rough time. China and Russia is nowhere. Western Europe is nowhere. And but at the same time, a small area called subcontinent of India, there the population today is already 2 billion people. And this is going to explode. Nobody thinks about it. There are 192 countries in the United Nations. They are not able to sit together and think about a solution.
I guess we're done. I guess that was the final word. Wonderful. Thank you so much to Dr. DeGooyer, and thank you so much, Dr. Steiner. So appreciate you all and your expertise and just being so open to sharing your Saturday morning with us. First and foremost, I gotta tell you, friends, we got a bunch of stuff coming up. First, we've got on Wednesday, April 12th at 7 o'clock at Flyleaf Books on MLK Boulevard, just down the street, we have a banjo and classical guitar program. What's so great about this event is when it's really low cost, it's only $5, and it's really family friendly. So there will be music, but also discussions. You can bring little ones, but then also engage your scholarly mind. I also want to plug that on Wednesday, April 28th at 7 o'clock, we have the adult spelling bee that will also be at Flyleaf Books. If you think of yourself as a strong speller, there are still spots for you to compete in the competition. If you loved this format of having folks talk at you, and again, you had to navigate the closed roads to get here. Now you know it'll be easier next time. Saturday, April 15th at 2 o'clock, we have American Empire in the 19th century Pacific. And then the following week, Saturday, April 22 at 2 o'clock, we have a seminar on France in World War II. Last but not least, because Dr. Steiner brought up Benedict Anderson and imagined communities, the Lloyd Kramer and I will be doing a talk on how France built its own national identity in the 19th century. That'll be on May 20th. I don't think you can even register for it yet, but you can all mark your calendars because we'll be here. Thank you so much. If those events aren't going to work for you, but they'll work for someone else you know, please share them with your network. We are so eager to continue our conversations and to hear your feedback, and see you again.